Live from the Mecca of Mormonism, Salt Lake City, Utah. This is Heart of the Matter, where we are learning to walk together in the age of fulfillment. I'm your host, Shawn McCraney. So we have talked about going from glory to glory while in this life as believers, walking in the Spirit, moving ourselves more away from the flesh and more into the Spirit. And last week we talked about what hangs in the balance. That was the name of the show, and Seth created a graphic for it that were donuts hanging there, and one was swung out like it was going to hit the other ones, you know, and what hangs in the balance. And I got to tell you, that's a show that I think is one of the better shows we've done for Christians. And I think you should give yourself 30 minutes of your life and listen to that show if you haven't done it. And whether believer or not, there's something that hangs in the balance for all of us, especially towards believers, relative to the suffering they are willing to endure in this life. And I don't mean physical suffering. I'm talking about suffering of the flesh. Tonight, I want to speak about a fundamental principle of Christianity and how sons and daughters can use the principle to kind of assess yourself in your walk as you amble forward toward a better resurrection, and which we talked about last week. In fact, let me pause here and just say, that's the point. I'll jump right to the end of what hangs in the balance, a better resurrection. If you're a Christian and you don't realize this, then you haven't been taught the scripture. Go back and watch Hanging in the Balance, and you'll learn about resurrection is the thing we are looking forward to and why it's important to Christians today. Anyway, the principle I want to talk about tonight is one that people aren't really They aren't really happy on hearing about, because whenever it's discussed, anytime this topic is brought forward, we all come up short. And that's no fun, is it? Coming up short in the face of a topic that we should be better at. And so we don't like to talk about it. But I have found that it is really only in genuine self-assessment, honest self-assessment, willing to look at your flaws and the cracks in your soul. You have to be able to do that as a means to then fill those cracks in with the love of God through His power and His might, so that you can heal and grow and become more full. So I would be remiss as a teacher of the Word if I didn't speak to the issue head on. And so here we go, sons and daughters of God. Prior to becoming a genuine Christian from the heart, rather than just a religious Mormon from the mouth, I was a big fan of the writings of Ayn Rand and what she determined, or what she called her philosophy of objectivism. Objectivism. Central to this philosophy is selfishness, something that Ayn Rand extols throughout her best-selling novels. She promotes selfishness as this ideal that individual human beings ought to embrace rather than refute. It doesn't take long reading any of Rand's works to note not only an undercurrent of anti-Christian sentimentalities in her philosophy, but there's also general godlessness. You don't see God mentioned in her books. There's an antipathy for children. In other words, you just don't see anything related to or spoken of with children. It's like it's just full of adults. There's no children around. And there's a disregard in her books, even a disdain for sympathy or empathy for disabled people, things like that. Now, why would that be? Why would she be dismissive of helping disabled people and ignore families and children in her long, detailed novels promoting selfishness? Perhaps we find the answer in asking, what are the common themes surrounding people who are disabled, children, the life of Christ, and even God? Selflessness are the themes that you find when you talk about Christ, God, when you're talking about life with children around you, when you're talking about disabled people in your life. Selflessness rises to the top. And because children require selfless adults to be in their lives, as do disabled people, selfless devotion to serving them through time and through love and attention and activities and finances and such things, they're anathema to Rand's objectivism and her objectivist views, which promote the value of self over everything else. And therefore, the wonders of selfishness are promoted in her philosophy. It's fascinating to me that Rand's Atlas Shrugged is listed as one of the most influential books ever written. Why? I think it's because central to the soul of all of us, human beings, is our self and our selfish nature. We are born self-centered, and we only grow in that capacity and in that focus as the time and the age and the years go on. Albert Camus, a French existentialist, said, "To be happy, one must not be too concerned for others." And I tend to agree with Camus if you want to be happy, but I do not think happiness is the key or goal or purpose of life, especially for a sold-out Christian. Happiness is not the goal. So he may be right. If you want to be happy in this life, Camus says, then you must not be too concerned about other people. And that means concern for their welfare too. Happiness, of course, is ephemeral and must be ironically served. You have to serve happiness and keep it alive and functioning in order to possess it. And joy is ethereal, and it abides outside of circumstances that we find ourselves in. And it would seem sort of ironic that I would be opposed to selfishness, as I am a proponent of what's called Christian subjectivism. But the two ought not find themselves ingredients of the same stew. All Christian subjectivism says is that the relationship between God and the individual human being is direct and personal and not subject to the demands or input of other people, including popes and prophets and pastors and priests, including religion. But the hope of such a direct relationship that I think is in subjective Christianity is founded on the idea that your faith will grow and culminate in greater selflessness in the believer and never less selflessness. So religion, it preys upon the innate selfishness of people as a means to overcome it. And it collectively makes demands upon its victims by giving mandated projects to take away the individual's time and money and gratitude and service. It tells each participant how much you should be praying and how much you should be giving and when and where you should be serving and why it's your turn in the group to be benevolent to the homeless downtown, etc., etc. As God judges the human heart of human beings, I suggest religion goes a long way to dress every human heart in fig leaves. And it covers up the selfish nature we all possess. See, this is key. Doing selfless things or being from the heart selfless. Both are good. Both are good, for sure, but one is far better than the other. Sons and daughters always want and seek what is better, not just what is good and acceptable. Heart selflessness can only come by and through each individual allowing Christ by his Spirit to operate in them. And when Christ is operating by the Spirit in you, you don't need a pastor, a priest, or prophet, or religion to tell you you've got to go out and serve. You have to pray this much. You have to give this much. Because Christ in your heart leads you to those levels of selflessness by his Spirit. So it's a dying to the flesh. The subtle absence of God, Christ, children, and the disdain for disabled people in Ayn Rand's books is a direct result of her disdain for selflessness. She hates it. And because in each case with children or God or Christ or the disabled, selflessness is demanded. So she doesn't address those topics at all in her books. Ask any parent what it takes to raise a child. It's selflessness. I mean, give it up. If you want to be a good parent, give up selfishness the minute that kid's born. Yeah, we all have selfishness, and I'm not saying you have to give your entire everything all the time to the child. That would be unhealthy. But I am saying that when a child comes in, selflessness comes in hand. Think about this. A mother chooses to play tennis, go to the mall, go clubbing at night, instead of feeding, bathing, clothing, or caring for an infant. The mother has to decide, I have to sacrifice these things that I like for the benefit of this other being who can't take care of themselves. That's selflessness. Bring a disabled person into the mix, and who often require a lifetime of care. And the point is made even more poignant. By the way, I'm personally amazed at people. I am blown away as an individual of people and parents who have disabled children and who raise them into adulthood their whole life and care for them with those special needs. That requires, especially severely disabled children, physically, mentally, emotionally, the love it takes to do that throughout the life of a child is incomprehensible to me. I'm so grateful that that hasn't been placed upon my life, because I don't know if I could stay the course, you know? And I'm amazed at the selflessness of people, let alone good parents, you know? So the model for selflessness begins with God himself. If you think about it, he created and cares, provides, gives comfort to the good and the evil. Jesus says he causes the sun and rain the rain to fall and the sun to shine on the good and the evil. He's giving. That's called giving. He gave you and I life. That's selflessness, right? And he provides the oxygen and the water, and in many cases, parents for most people in the early years of life. He gave us seas that are full of fish and plains full of herds and crops. But most importantly, he gave us his only human son to the world. He gave that son, So selflessness is part of his credo right there. He bestows his patience, his long-suffering, his mercy, his kindness that we do not deserve. That's God. God is love. God is selfless. If he was a selfish God, we would be living in a very different world. Maybe one we had to fall down and pray every day for 20 minutes in order to get a breath of oxygen or something like that. So if he was selfish, we would live in a very different world, but he's not. Look at his son, who's God with us, God made flesh. What do you see? A selfless life that he lived from start to finish, in the end offering up his own life for the sins of the world. That's the giving, selfless behavior of Christ. To those who follow him, it's important to see that he chose to live selflessly, and that he had a will, and it certainly had desires that he wanted to do things a little differently than his father. but he always chose to do the Father's will. That's selfless on behalf of the world. Note, he didn't choose to do the will of men. Note that he didn't choose to do the will of religion. In fact, we read early in the Gospel of John the following. Now, when Jesus was in Jerusalem at the Passover, in the feast day, many believed in his name when they saw the miracles which he did. Listen to these passages. They've always been of interest to me. But Jesus did not commit himself unto them because he knew all men, and needed not that any should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. Jesus didn't have to go and get the approval and approbation of men. He knew what was in him, is what that says. He only did what the Father wanted. He stayed away from men, the scripture says, because he knows what was in man. He created us. Selflessly, without exception, fulfilling the law and the prophets, giving to the world all that he had in return, sons and daughters follow him, the Lord Jesus Christ, not only in what he taught people to do, which is love and to have faith, but to live the way he lived, which was by the Spirit, selflessly. What did he teach exactly? He taught faith and he taught love. Faith in what God commands us to be and do, and love moving our ability to do them. The whole picture from God to Christ to the Spirit is one of giving, of for the other before self, of putting their needs ahead of our wants, of looking to the welfare of others ahead of our own needs. It's truly a paradox that this world promotes the self. It promotes self like no other. Selfish, self through most of its representations. Selfies, I mean, it's just ubiquitous. We are taking selfies and luxurious living and indulgences and aberrant moralities in life and my wants and my way, but this same world that is promoting self and selfishness contradictorily is repulsed by the outcome of these promotions when they're manifested in crime and sin and betrayals of trust. It's pure irony, stupidity really. It's akin to having a parent who lives completely a selfish life, but expects their child to be respectful, loving, kind, and generous toward them. It doesn't work. Or when a society demands equal, fair, kind treatment of everybody on the earth, we want everyone to be equal. And you must be equal. You must be fair. We demand it. In fact, we will enforce it. Doesn't make sense. And then we will tear down businesses of responsible owners, and we'll tear down statues from public places if you don't do what we want. How can you demand equality and at the same time destroy people's property? It's craziness that this world, which is bathing itself in the self, turns around and expects the world to be selfless because it doesn't behave that way. This is all the result of selfishness being at the root of man. We want our way. Jesus, the only solution, taught otherwise, and sons and daughters know it. Selflessness begins in the mind and heart, and it extends out to the life of the individual and to their hands in the world. And we will never be a selfless world in word and deed if we are not first selfless in mind and heart. It will never happen. Such a state comes with indwelling of the Spirit of Christ, the embodiment of selflessness, promoting us, prompting us, pulling us to helping us see a better way to live purposeful existences, godly existences, Christ-like existences aimed for life eternal. And it's a life that is concerned with the true welfare of all people, not just some, all. Understand, I'm not suggesting Christians to be a doormat to the world. Jesus was no doormat, and we certainly see him taking time for himself to go recharge his batteries and to set his flesh right as he went to go and communicate with his Father. But in the end, the offering of his life for the world through the death of himself is the model for sons and daughters to seek. That's our model, to take up our cross, to die daily, to rise to new life, and walk in the power of his resurrection. That's it. And it's not easy, my friends. It can be insufferable to hold your tongue when you could destroy somebody with it, and to give attention to the takers, and to forgive the sinners and the offenders. It's brutal. I'm not up here preaching because I can do all this. I'm just preaching because I know it's the way it should be. In every case, what you are saying when you're selfless is, I am dying to my will and I'm doing the will of my Father. And that's what his sons and daughters did, because that's what his son did. Let me conclude by sharing with you the fact that while selfishness is innate and central to the human flesh, true selflessness is acquired and learned over time with the Spirit of Christ in you. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long, persistent, patient quest to have selflessness develop within your person. Give him an inch into your heart. Ask him to take over and to work his work. And when presented with the opportunity to feed the self, try to consider turning that opportunity over to serving him. And it is a relinquishment of the self. That's what it is. You are dying. You are choosing to say, okay, let me pull back and give him room to work. Give him a try. He will, as your good shepherd, lead you to the still waters to drink from. And when you look in that water, you'll see a reflection someday you won't believe, because it won't be who you started out with. And that is what you look for as a son and daughter. It's not just accepting Jesus as a Savior. It's then learning to have him dwell and bring us to that better resurrection that we talked about last week. I talked about Ayn Rand to start off with. I want to talk about another author who is morally superior in his writings to Rand, and that is Dostoyevski. And in The Brothers Karamazov, he wrote the following: "The world says, you have needs, satisfy them. You have as much a right as the rich and the mighty. Don't hesitate to satisfy your needs. Indeed, expand your needs and demand more." This is the worldly doctrine of today, he writes. And they believe that this is freedom. The result for the rich is isolation and suicide. For the poor, envy and murder. We're not of the world that Dostoyevsky wrote about. We are not subject to the end results of selfishness, which he says for the rich is suicide. I just read about a guy who, when he was 18 at Stanford, his grandfather gave him $600 million. And he quit Stanford and he became a movie producer, and he produced the Polar Express movie with Tom Hanks. And he did these other movies, and he was a bigwig, and he's a swinger with the women, and he was a partier, and he was a great guy. And he jumped off a 26-story building at 50 years old last week. Dostoyevsky's right. For the rich, the doctrine of selfishness leads to isolation and suicide. The guy's so insightful. And for the poor, selfishness leads to envy and murder. He's dead on. We aren't part of that world and those mechanisms that operate within the people who are trapped in those things. We have a different master, and he was selfless, and he controlled his will, and he allowed the Spirit of God in him to move him through to perfection. We're not perfect. We never will be. We never started off being that way. But we have the opportunity as sons and daughters to allow him in to move us to make the flesh less present and the Spirit more. And in time, it will envelop you and it will help you overcome the ways that we are. So go to him. And in the meantime, write your comments below and we'll read them tomorrow night here on Heart of the Matter.